wake up tired, you open your eyes and already feel guilty. The day hasn't even started and the body has already lost it. And you call this laziness. But what if I told you that what you call laziness is the most faithful way your unconscious has found to keep saving you? Carl Jung would call this the shadow, the trauma that has learned to disguise itself as apathy. The spirituality you seek is not in the effort. It is in the pause you avoid. The body didn't stop because it gave up. It stopped because it remembers. And while you force yourself to run, your inner child is still on its knees, trying to survive a danger that ended decades ago. If this tears you up inside, sign up now, because no one here will spare you the truth. Your laziness is not a flaw, it's loyalty. Most people hate themselves for what they call laziness, but what they call weakness is actually the body trying to survive what the mind has forgotten. Carl Jung said that the unconscious never forgets, it just changes form. That paralyzing tiredness, that I can't begin feeling, isn't laziness. It's the inner child, still trembling silently, protecting you from something that was once too dangerous to face. The ego calls it apathy, the psyche calls it defense. It's spirituality, showing that the body also prays, sometimes through immobility. When the self is wounded, it cries out for the body, and the body responds by stopping. The problem is that society only values movement, never the reason. So you've learned to blame yourself for not producing without realizing that this not doing is a cry for safety. When you procrastinate, it's not because you don't want to. It's because a part of you still believes that trying again is like dying a little. Think about it. Perhaps every time you blame yourself for not acting, you're reproducing the voice that once silenced you. Get up, do something, you're no good standing still. This phrase has become engraved like a psychic tattoo. Now, every time you try to act, your unconscious sounds the alarm, danger, and your body freezes. This isn't a defect, it's unconscious fidelity. True spirituality isn't about forcibly breaking your body, but about listening to what the silence wants to say. Reading Jung is understanding that the unconscious speaks through symptoms, and laziness is one of them. It's the shadow asking to be heard, not overcome. When you begin to realize that your "I can't" is a cry for care, everything changes. Inner healing begins when you stop beating yourself up and start listening. This isn't about indulgence, it's about awareness. The ego wants to make you run, the self wants to make you understand, and between the two lies an abyss of guilt, where you've been living. Perhaps the path isn't to get up, but to lie down differently, with presence, to breathe, to ask your body what it fears, and not to force it to function. What seems like laziness may be your psyche's way of not breaking down anymore. And if you have the courage to listen to this silence, you might discover something deeper. Something that isn't about what you don't do, but about what you haven't yet managed to release. Within every adult lives a child who has never aged. It carries in its hands the exact moment the world stopped being safe. Carl Jung called these autonomous fragments of the psyche, parts of us trapped in time. You've grown into the body, but that child is still there, standing before the door where love became a threat. Real spirituality isn't about ascending, but about descending to that frozen point and listening to it. Because the inner child doesn't understand calendars. It still lives in the same dark room, with the same fear, with the same racing heart. When you feel like you can't act, it's the child who holds your arm. It still believes the danger hasn't passed, and the ego, not understanding, tries to silence it by force. Think about the times you sabotaged yourself, that voice telling you it's going to fail, that urge to give up halfway. This doesn't come from the present. It comes from a time when trying meant losing love, being criticized, being punished. You call it procrastination, but it's loyalty. It's your psyche trying to keep you alive the only way it knew how. And herein lies the Jungian paradox. The same force that once saved you now imprisons you. The shadow child doesn't want to destroy you, it wants to protect you, but it doesn't know the danger is over. And until the self descends and shows it otherwise, it will continue to freeze its body to keep its heart whole. Inner healing begins when you stop trying to heal this child and begin to recognize it as part of yourself. This is individuation, the encounter between what remained and what followed. Try writing to it, not with pity, but with truth. Say, "You no longer need to protect me, I am here." This is not imaginary therapy, it is symbolic reprogramming. Jung did this with stones, drawings, dreams. The method doesn't matter, the contact matters. When the adult embraces the child, time begins to flow again. And what was once fear begins to move again, slowly, like ice melting in the sun. But this thawing brings something deeper, the understanding that the body never forgot what the heart tried to bury. When the danger was too great to fight and impossible to escape, the body chose the third option, freeze. Jung understood this as an archaic wisdom of the psyche, the self trying to preserve life when the ego no longer knew what to do. This state, which biology calls freeze, is not cowardice, it is strategy. It is the body's primitive spirituality saying, "If I can't win, I disappear." Decades later, this same mechanism still operates. The email you don't answer, the project you postpone, the conversation you avoid, all these are the echoes of a body that has learned to hide to avoid being hurt. The mind calls you lazy, the body simply fulfills its ancient duty of keeping you alive. Freezing is a silent prayer. Let nothing see me. The psyche has learned that being seen is dangerous. And so, even at peace, it keeps the alarm going. The heart races for no reason, the throat closes, the breath shortens. It's not ill will, it's cellular memory. The unconscious doesn't understand time. It reacts to the present with reflections of the past. And so the adult who tries to act is held back by the child who still fears being punished for existing. Jung said that the unconscious has its own will, and when we ignore it, it manifests in the body. Procrastination is the unconscious pulling the emergency brake to avoid collapse. It's not resistance to work, it's resistance to pain. To escape this state, there's no point in pushing your body with shouts of encouragement. The body doesn't obey force, it only responds to safety. That's why inner healing requires retraining the nervous system, not just changing your thoughts. If your body doesn't believe it's safe to act, it won't move. You can start slowly, a warm bath to feel your skin, a deep breath before a task, a touch on your chest saying, "It's safe now." The psyche needs to feel the present, not hear it. Freezing only dissolves with experiences of safety. And when the body begins to believe this, something changes. The ice begins to give way. But along with this melting comes a deeper shock. Realizing that what you call weakness is actually old love trying to protect you. You call it self-sabotage, but it's loyalty. The most tragic and invisible of loyalties, that of the inner child to its own past. Carl Jung said that nothing is more powerful than what we don't know we're obeying. And that's exactly what happens when the ego tries to advance. But the unconscious pulls back. You believe you're afraid of failure, but in reality, you're afraid of betraying someone. Perhaps a critical father, a mother who only smiled when you diminished yourself, or an environment that taught you that brilliance brings punishment. Your "I can't" is an ancient promise. Mommy, I'll never be better than you. Daddy, I'll never contradict you. It's an unconscious fidelity to pain, a kind of silent pact between the past and the present. Jung saw this all the time in his patients, adults trapped in patterns of failure that were actually attempts to remain loved. The child didn't want success, he wanted security, and if love came with limitation, he learned to limit himself to remain loved. The shadow arises from this kind of exchange. Shadowless spirituality calls it blockage. Jung called it unconscious destiny. Until the adult realizes that he is not fighting laziness, but a system of emotional fidelity, he will continue to repeat the same script, trying, stalling, giving up, blaming himself. The body is not sabotaging, it is being loyal to those who once were everything. Breaking this loyalty is a spiritual act, not a moral one. It's a sacred transgression. You need to look within and say, I can love you without repeating your pain. It's simple to say, but devastating to feel, because betraying the pattern is, for an instant, betraying one's own origin. That's why awakening hurts. It breaks invisible contracts with the family unconscious. Want an exercise? Write a letter to the one you still fear disappointing. Say, I honor you, but I move on. This is true Jungian liberation, not killing the past, but integrating it into the self, like a scar that now knows its story. And it is there, in that moment when you decide to free yourself, that the unconscious reacts. It tries to paralyze you again, because the next step is the most dangerous, the one where you stop obeying fear and begin to listen to your own voice. There's a prison you can't see. It has no bars, no guards, just an immobile body and a mind saturated with guilt. It's the prison of non-action. Jung said the unconscious abhors emptiness, which is why, when you stop, it fills the silence with judgments. You should be doing something, it whispers. But what no one tells you is that this emptiness is precisely the portal to the self. The immobility you condemn may be the point where the old dies and the new has not yet been born. The psyche needs this pause to reorganize itself, but the ego, accustomed to measuring value by performance, panics. And then the cycle begins: guilt, paralysis, self-defense. The body freezes, and you call laziness what is, in fact, an old mourning for the loss of control. Non-action is a sacred anesthesia. The unconscious protects you by stopping time. When the inner child has learned that action brings pain, it prefers imprisonment to exposure. It's like a bird that, after so many cages, no longer believes in heaven. Therefore, the more you try to force movement, the more the body hardens. It doesn't trust. And the Jungian paradox is this: movement only returns when you accept being still, when you stop seeing rest as failure and begin to recognize it as a symptom of spiritual exhaustion. In practical terms, this means replacing the verb to do with to feel. Before acting, ask, what in me is still frozen? This is the kind of question the ego hates, but the unconscious understands. You need to understand that there is no inner healing without pause. Haste is a sophisticated form of escape. Jung called it neurotic activism, the impulse to act only to avoid feeling. But individuation happens in the silence between one action and another. When the body finally breathes without fear, movement returns, not as an obligation, but as a natural expression of the self. The shadow of laziness transforms into presence. If you want to begin, start small. Get up and simply walk around the house feeling the ground, not to get somewhere, but to remember that you can still move. It is in the simplest gesture that the psyche tests freedom. But before experiencing true rest, you will need to face a deeper fear, the fear of rest. There are people who can't rest, not because they don't want to, but because rest has been conditioned by guilt. Jung observed that many of those who appeared lazy were in fact exhausted inside. They didn't rest, they collapsed. And there's a stark difference between the two. Rest is conscious, collapse is defense. When the psyche lives under the command of voices that say, you're only valuable when you produce, the simple act of stopping becomes dangerous. Spirituality becomes distorted and becomes slavery disguised as virtue, and the ego, shaped by trauma, transforms rest into an internal enemy. You lie down, but your mind keeps racing. The body is still, but the soul is in panic. It's the unconscious saying, to stop is to die. The inner child learned this early. Every time it tried to breathe, the critical look came. Are you done yet? Are you just going to lie there? And so it grew up believing that fatigue was shame. Today, adults feel guilty for doing what is natural, stopping. The trauma of rest is the spiritual exhaustion of the modern age. Exhausted bodies, saturated minds, and souls without a resting place. Jung would say that we are possessed by a collective archetype of productivity, a modern God that demands sacrifice in exchange for value. And the body pays this price with insomnia, anxiety, and breakdowns. The self doesn't want to see you productive. It wants to see you whole. And wholeness includes pause, non-doing, silence. Rest for many is the hardest work because true rest requires trust. Trust that the world won't fall apart if you stop for a moment. And trauma destroys that trust. That's why, when trying to rest, the body reacts with restlessness. The psyche fears emptiness, and emptiness feels dangerous. If you want to reverse this, don't start by forcing rest. Start by cultivating security. Close your eyes for 3 minutes and say, I can stop and still be worthy. This is more than a phrase, it's unconscious reprogramming. Rest isn't the absence of value, it's the reconstruction of it. But before the body learns to rest, something even deeper will be needed. Relearning to trust life, feeling that body and soul can become one again. Carl Jung said that the body is the stage where the unconscious acts out everything the mind refuses to remember. The body speaks in the language of symptoms, fatigue, and silent tension. And when it falls silent, it's because it has given up on being heard. Spirituality that ignores the body is just another form of escape, disguised as elevation. The ego wants to ascend, but the soul wants to return home, and home is the body. Individuation only happens when you descend into it, when you hear the trembling of your hands, the tightness in your chest, the shallowness of your breath. These are the gospels of the unconscious. The self doesn't ask you to transcend the body, but to inhabit it. The body is the altar where the psyche attempts to reconcile with the spirit. And it is there, in what you feel, that the process of inner healing truly begins. Most people try to understand trauma, but trauma doesn't want to be understood. It wants to be felt safely. That's why Jung insisted on living through. It's not enough to understand that you're frozen. You have to go through the ice. This means giving the body space to react without punishing it. Want a practical example? When you feel frozen, don't force the movement. Place your hand on your chest and say, I am here. Breathe like you're trying to wake a friend who's been asleep for years. The unconscious responds to tenderness, not violence. Mature spirituality doesn't rush, it approaches. That's what the body needs, not orders, but presence. When you treat it with respect, it opens like a wound that finally finds light. The reintegration of body and soul is a silent marriage. The psyche needs the body to remember what safety is. The body needs the psyche to remember what is felt. When these two reunite, something Jung called living individuation is born. The experience of being whole, not divided between who you show and who you feel. Want an exercise? When you wake up, before you think, feel. Where is there tension? Where is there emptiness? And without trying to change, simply acknowledge. Acknowledgement heals more than any forced action. This is when the body begins to trust the soul again, and the soul finally remembers the body. But this reunion awakens a new urgency within you to free the child who could never feel this. The inner child doesn't need promises, it needs permission. Jung said that the unconscious lies waiting for a gesture that never happened. The moment someone finally says, you can rest, you can fail, you can be unaware, you can exist without needing to justify yourself. This is where inner healing begins. When the adult self becomes the father and mother the ego never had. True spirituality isn't transcendence. It's symbolic reparenting. It's allowing the psyche to feel safe within its own body. The problem is that for years, you've become accustomed to confusing discipline with abandonment. You thought it was about correcting yourself, when what the unconscious always wanted was to be embraced. And until you give yourself this permission, you'll remain stuck between wanting and being able. This is what individuation is, learning to authorize yourself. And this authorization doesn't come from the intellect, it comes from the body believing it's safe to be. Want a practical exercise? Take a piece of paper and write, "I give myself permission to," and complete it with whatever you fear most. It could be resting, making mistakes, speaking, trying again. This simple gesture is a Jungian ritual. It communicates to the unconscious something it's never heard before, that the danger is over. Jung did this with his patients. He asked them to write permissions, not goals. Because trauma isn't healed by imposition, but by freedom. When you give yourself permission, the body lets go, the ego gives in, and the shadow approaches. It's the moment the past realizes it can finally rest within you. But be careful. Permission is not indulgence. It's courage. Giving yourself permission means facing the fear of existing without control. It means allowing yourself to be seen without the masks of the ego. It means enduring the discomfort of not knowing who you are without your guilt. This is the crossing that separates the wounded self from the whole self. When you give yourself permission, the inner child stops asking for help and begins to accompany you. And this union is what Jung called the reconciliation between conscious and unconscious. You no longer need to force, you need to allow. But when this permission begins to open space within you, something inevitable happens. The return of what has always been waiting to emerge, your true self. There comes a point in the journey where the ego finally bows, not in defeat, but in reverence. Jung said that the self is the totality that watches the ego struggle, fail, and try to control the uncontrollable. The return to the self is not an ascent, it is a descent to the depths where shadow and light recognize each other. After so much trying to improve yourself, you discover that true transformation comes when you stop correcting yourself and start embracing yourself. Spirituality without self-acceptance is just another mask of the ego trying to be spiritual. Inner healing doesn't seek your perfection, it seeks your presence. The self awakens when you say, "Even frozen, I am still whole." It is at this moment that laziness reveals itself as compassion, the unconscious trying to teach you to slow down until you feel your soul returning to your body. The return to the self is the collapse of the identities you used to be loved. It's when the psyche stops asking the world for permission to exist. Jung called this individuation, becoming who you always were before you had to be someone else to survive. It's the most radical and solitary process there is, because in it, you must separate yourself from everything that isn't you. Expectations, roles, masks. The ego screams, the body resists, the shadow stirs. But this is how the psyche matures, through the friction between the old and the new. You feel fear because you are being born again, and every birth requires pain. The self doesn't want to comfort you, it wants to free you, and to do so, it destroys everything you've built on fear. When you begin to live from the self, the world ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a mirror. Everything that irritates you reveals what has not yet been integrated. Everything that inspires you reveals what is already yours, only forgotten. This is the point where spirituality ceases to be an escape and becomes a daily practice. Looking within before reacting, feeling before deciding, existing before proving. You realize that the inner child, the ego, the shadow, and the self are not enemies. They are voices in the same choir, each singing a part of your story. The return to the self is not the end of the road, but the beginning of a new cycle where acting and being reunite. And it is in this silent union that the soul finally begins to thaw. There comes a moment when the ice begins to give way, and it never tells you when. Jung called it a living transformation, the instant the unconscious melts under the heat of consciousness. The thawing of the soul isn't pretty, it's brutal. The body trembles, the tears come for no reason, and something inside you begins to move for the first time in years. It's the shadow melting, the self making room for what was once buried. Laziness dissolves, fear transforms into a pulse, and what seemed like weakness reveals itself to be strength, the strength of those who survived freezing. The ego, for the first time, understands it wasn't the enemy, it was the messenger. The psyche just wanted you to slow down enough to hear it. The ice isn't death, it's pause. It's the soul waiting for someone to come back for it. This thawing is slow. There are no formulas, only presence. Each tear that escapes is a fragment of the unconscious being freed. True spirituality is not made of mantras or affirmations, but of the courage to feel what has always been avoided. Jung said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making darkness conscious. That's it. Making fear, apathy, and emptiness conscious and remaining there without running away. This is how the ice gives way. Gradually, the body begins to breathe again. Laughter forgotten reappears. The soul once again occupies the space emptied by trauma. What was guilt becomes compassion. What was paralysis becomes sacred pause. What was pain becomes testimony. And for the first time, silence ceases to be punishment and becomes home. But the thawing of the soul comes at a price. You can never again pretend you don't know. Once the self awakens, there is no returning to the ego's slumber. Consciousness demands responsibility, to remain present even when it would be easier to numb yourself again. Now you understand that it wasn't laziness, never was. It was the psyche's call for reconciliation. And when that call is answered, movement returns, not as effort but as flow. The body acts because it is at peace, not because it is under command. The shadow dances, the ego observes, the self guides. The cold disappears, and in its place something serene is born, a spirituality that doesn't deny the human, but embraces it. And it is in this embrace that the soul finally thaws. Aren't you tired of trying to fix yourself? Pretending it's a lack of strength when what's missing is a hug. Calling laziness what, deep down, is just your body begging to be left alone. Do you constantly punish yourself for not taking action? But have you ever wondered what would happen if you stopped fighting? What if the emptiness you fear is not the end, but the beginning of your return? What if what you call failure is just your soul pulling you back into the body you abandoned years ago? Maybe you don't need to do anything. Maybe you just need to feel what you've always tried to forget. Maybe true awakening is accepting that there is nothing wrong with you. There is only a heart too tired to continue pretending it doesn't hurt. If this tore you up inside, sign up now, because this was just the first cut.